The relationship looks, from the outside, like a quiet success story. He works hard. He calls his mother every Sunday. He has that warm, slightly anxious decency that everyone's friends remark on. He's so devoted to his family, they say, like it's a compliment, like you haven't started to suspect it's also the job description you accidentally signed. What no one tells you, when you marry the first-generation American, the one born here to parents who weren't, the one who is American the way a bridge is a road, by carrying the weight of two sides at once, is that you are not marrying a man. You are marrying an arrival story. You are marrying a debt that predates you, a promise made on a different continent, and a mother who will love you exactly as much as you make her son's life look like proof the whole journey was worth it. You said yes to a person. You inherited a project. 1. The man you married came with a country. In the beginning, his difference is the most beautiful thing about him. He is grounded in a way the men you dated before were not. He has somewhere he comes from. He talks about his parents with a tenderness that makes your own family seem oddly weightless, like everyone just sort of drifted into adulthood without owing anyone anything. You fall for the gravity of him, the way he treats family as a fact rather than a choice. The food. The stories about the small apartment, the 2 jobs, the father who didn't sleep for a decade so the son could sleep soundly. You think, this is a serious person. This is someone who knows what things cost. What you don't yet understand is that you are now inside the math, because the first-generation American doesn't experience family as a relationship. He experiences it as an obligation that has been load-bearing his entire life. Nearly 6 in 10 first-generation Americans say they feel obligated to financially support their parents or extended family, and about half actually do. He was the translator at the bank when he was 9. He read the lease before his father signed it. He has been an adult since before he was allowed to drive, and somewhere along the way, being needed stopped feeling like a burden and started feeling like love itself. So when you ask him, gently, to choose you first, just this once, just this one holiday, he hears something you did not say. He hears abandon them. He hears the sound of the whole sacrifice meaning nothing. You learn fast not to make him choose, not because he'd choose them, because the question itself makes you the villain. You marry a man and discover you've moved into a house that was already full. 2. There is a third person in your marriage, and she cooked dinner. His mother is not unkind. That's what makes it complicated. She would, in fact, walk into traffic for you, provided you were carrying her grandchild at the time. But she has a relationship with your husband that began before language did, and she is not interested in renegotiating its terms because a wife showed up. You will spend the first 2 years trying to win her approval, and the next 10 realizing approval was never on the menu. What's on the menu is usefulness. Are you making her son happy? Are you feeding him correctly? Are you producing the future she paid for in advance? You start noticing the rules nobody wrote down. You do not correct him in front of her. You do not serve yourself before the elders. You do not, under any circumstances, suggest that maybe Sunday could occasionally be your day. The first time you skip a family lunch for something as frivolous as your own exhaustion, the silence that follows will be educational. The cruelest part is the language. When his family slips into the one you don't speak, at the table, mid-laugh, eyes flicking toward you in a way, you learn to smile at the rhythm of a sentence you can't translate. Research on early marriage finds that wives are most likely to feel ambivalent toward their in-laws when they're living inside a multi-generational household, which is a clinical way of saying, it is hard to feel at home in a home that has a host, and your husband, caught between the 2 women who run his life, does the thing he has always done. He keeps the peace by asking the safer one to bend. That's you. You're the safer one. Your love is the one he can afford to take for granted, because it isn't load-bearing yet. You wanted to marry into a close family. You did. You just didn't realize close was a synonym for small, and you'd be standing slightly outside it. 3. The money was never only yours. Here is the conversation that doesn't happen before the wedding, because it would feel grotesque to have it. The one about the money that leaves your household every month and does not come back. Of the first-generation Americans who support their families, many send $300 or more every month, and a quarter of them say it's keeping them from covering their own basic needs. You will not find this line on the joint budget spreadsheet. It lives somewhere else. It lives under the heading of things that are simply done, the way other couples auto-pay the electric bill. At first you don't mind. It's noble. You married a man who takes care of people. You'd be a monster to resent the taking care. But noble has a way of curdling around the 11th month, when the roof needs work, and the answer is, we'll wait. And you realize you are waiting so that a house you have visited twice, in a country you've seen once, can have its own roof first. You learn that in this marriage, family emergency is a phrase that bypasses every boundary. Therapists who work with adult children of immigrants describe it as living with zero margin for error. The family's emergency fund and your emergency fund are quietly the same fund. Saying no is not a financial decision. It is a moral accusation. It means you think his parents' suffering was a bad investment. So you don't say no, you say of course. You become fluent in of course. And you start keeping a private ledger in your head, not of dollars, but of the things the dollars were supposed to become. The trip you postponed, the savings that stayed flat, the second income that disappeared into a generosity you admire, and also, in the dark, on the bad nights, quietly hate. The worst part is you can't even be angry cleanly, because you'd want a son like him. You'd want to be remembered like that. You just didn't know that loving a man who'll never abandon his family meant finding out, slowly, where you rank on the list of people he'll never abandon. 4. You learn to smile in 2 languages. There is a performance you didn't audition for, and you give it constantly. In public, you are the proof. At the cousin's wedding, at the christening, at the endless table of an occasion you can't pronounce, you are the wife who fits in beautifully, who tries the food, who learned the 3 phrases that make the aunties light up. You wear the outfit. You hold the smile. You are, for the afternoon, evidence that the family chose well, that their son did them proud, that America did not dilute them after all. Your own people get a different performance. At your friend's brunch, when someone asks how married life is, you say it's wonderful, because the truth, I love a man who comes with a cue, does not survive contact with a mimosa. You've stopped trying to explain it. The friends who married men with no gravity and no obligations look at your life and see only the warmth, the big loud table, the in-laws who die for you. You're so lucky, they say. You agree. You are. That's the part that makes it hard to complain. The holidays are where the 2 performances collide. Every December becomes a negotiation conducted with the gravity of a hostage exchange. Whose family? Which day? How many hours? And the unspoken truth that his family's claim is not a preference, but a law of physics. You will spend your anniversary at his mother's because his mother's calendar does not recognize the existence of your anniversary. You will learn to find this funny before you learn to find it acceptable. And somewhere in year 4 or 5, you catch yourself doing the thing you swore you wouldn't. You start performing for yourself. You narrate your own marriage as the lucky one, in your own head, hoping repetition will turn it true. The neighbors think you're the couple who has it figured out. You are still, technically, having date nights. They just mostly involve his mother's health, a wire transfer, and someone gently mentioning that his cousin needs a place to stay for just a few months. You smile in 2 languages. You're fluent in neither. 5. Resentment is just love. That got tired of waiting? Nobody warns you that resentment doesn't arrive as an event. It arrives as sediment. It builds in the small, unaccounted for things. The way his phone lights up at dinner, and you already know, from the ringtone, that the evening is now about someone else. The way we'll talk about it later has become a place where conversations go to die. The way you've started rehearsing your grievances in the shower, delivering devastating monologues to the tile, because the real version always seems to land at a moment when his family needs him, and you'd look heartless for needing him too. So you develop your rituals. Everyone in this marriage has one. His is the Sunday call. Yours might be the long drive with no destination, or the friend you vent to who's promised never to repeat it, or the hour after he falls asleep when the house is finally only yours. People who grow up inside this kind of obligation describe it as a debt that, by its nature, can never be repaid. Not in money, not in years, not in anything. What no one mentions is that the spouse inherits the debt without ever having received the sacrifice. You're servicing a loan that was taken out before you were in the picture. The resentment is dangerous precisely because it has nowhere legitimate to go. You can't resent his dead grandmother. You can't resent the years his father worked nights. You can't resent love, devotion, gratitude. These are the good qualities, the ones you married him for. So the resentment, denied a target, turns sideways. It comes out as a snippy comment about the dishes, a sigh with too much information in it, a fight about something microscopic that is secretly about something enormous. You become an expert in the passive-aggressive logistics of the unsaid. You don't say, "I feel like I come last." You say, "Fine, go," with a particular weight on the fine that you both understand perfectly and will both pretend you didn't hear. The marriage isn't failing. It's just being quietly held together by routine, shared logins, and the fact that the two of you are too tired to do anything but stay. 6. You become a translator too. The strangest thing the years do is this. You start becoming what you married. You came in as the outsider, the American wife, the one who didn't know the customs. And slowly, without deciding to, you become a translator yourself. You're the one who explains his family to your family. You're the one who manages the calendar, who remembers the birthdays back home, who has somehow learned to make the dish his mother makes, because someone will have to make it when she's gone, and you've quietly understood that someone is you. You take on the emotional labor of two worlds. First-generation Americans often spend their childhoods as the bridge, the translator at the bank, the bookkeeper, the adult before they were grown. You marry one of them and discover the bridge needs maintaining, and you've been handed the toolkit. You manage his guilt. You soften his refusals. You're the one who says, "We just can't this month," so he doesn't have to be the son who said no. And there's a part of this you didn't expect to love, because there is something real here. A kind of belonging that your friends with their weightless families will never quite have. Immigrant-rooted families are markedly more likely to stay intact. Among some communities, the rate of stable marriage runs above 90%. You are inside something that holds. The table is loud. The love is total, even when it isn't fair. When your own life cracks, an entire battalion of people you can barely speak to will show up with food and refuse to leave. You stop being a guest. You become a fixture. It is the most claustrophobic safety you have ever known. The question that haunts the quiet years is, no longer do they accept me, it's who am I now? Because the woman who walked into this marriage had edges, opinions, a Sunday that belonged to her. The woman 10 years in has folded herself, fold by reasonable fold, into a shape that fits the family. You didn't lose yourself in a dramatic way. You misplaced yourself, one of course at a time. 7. Why you stay. You stay for reasons that would sound insane to the version of you that said the vows. You stay because somewhere in the exhaustion, there is a man who, when his mother finally needed care, didn't hesitate. And you understood, with a clarity that frightened you, that he would do the same for you. The devotion that crowds you is the same devotion that will never, ever leave you. You can't have one without the other. The man who will never abandon his family is, it turns out, a man who will never abandon you either. You just have to live inside the never abandon, which is roomier for some people than others. You stay because the alternative, a man with no gravity, who'd choose you every time because nothing else was pulling, sounds free, and you've started to suspect that free is just another word for unanchored. Your married friends with the weightless husbands are not, you've noticed, conspicuously happier. They got the easy yes. You got the impossible one, the one that means something precisely because it was hard to win. You stay because of the table, because somewhere along the way, it became your table too. Because the children you raised here have grandparents who would burn the world down for them. And you can't put a price on that, even on the months when you tried. And you stay because leaving would require you to call all of it a mistake. The years, the of courses, the dish you finally learned to make. And you're not willing to do that. It wasn't a mistake. It was a marriage. They look identical from certain angles, especially late at night, especially in the car, especially in the particular silence of two people who love each other and are tired in the exact same place. You stay because you stopped waiting to come first and started understanding that first was never the real prize. The prize was being woven in, being load-bearing yourself, finally. The day his family calls you in a crisis, not your husband you, is the day you realize you stopped being the outsider years ago. You're inside now. You're holding up your corner of something old and heavy, and against all your better instincts, beautiful. Nobody tells you that being chosen second by someone who never leaves might outlast being chosen first by someone who eventually does. You'd never put it on a wedding invitation. But it's the truth you've been living, fold by reasonable fold, this whole time. You did not marry a man. You married a man, his mother, a country you visited twice, and a debt that was never yours and is now, somehow, the most expensive thing you own. And the strangest part, the part you'll never say out loud at brunch, is that if someone offered you the easy version, the weightless one, the man who came alone with no one behind him, you're not sure you'd take it.